The mansion stood like a monument to wealth, a sprawling estate with tall marble columns, polished floors, and chandeliers that sparkled like 1,000 diamonds. To outsiders, it looked like the picture of perfection, a place where no sorrow could ever enter. But inside its walls lived a man whose riches had hardened his heart. The millionaire, known for his ruthless business strategies, carried the same coldness into his home. Nothing ever pleased him completely. No gesture, no act of service, and no amount of dedication from his staff could escape his critical eye. For those who worked for him, every day felt like walking on glass. One wrong move could mean the end of their job. The housekeepers especially knew his unforgiving nature. Each morning, they polished the furniture until it gleamed, dusted every corner, and ensured that the marble floors shone so brightly they reflected like mirrors. Yet, even after hours of hard work, the millionaire would sweep through the halls, his eyes scanning like a hawk, always searching for something imperfect. If he found even a speck of dust on a railing or noticed a streak on a window, his anger would rise. He never shouted loudly, but his tone was sharper than any scream. His words carried humiliation, making those around him feel small, insignificant, and dispensable. The first housekeeper had lasted only 3 weeks. She was diligent, working tirelessly from dawn to midnight, but one morning she forgot to arrange the fresh flowers in the guest room. To the millionaire, this was unacceptable. Without hesitation, he dismissed her, offering no gratitude for the countless tasks she had completed flawlessly. The second housekeeper tried harder, ensuring every detail was perfect, but she mistakenly placed his favorite book on the wrong shelf in the study. That, too, was enough to seal her fate. It went on like this. One after another, the housekeepers were fired for what seemed like the smallest of errors. A cup left in the wrong cabinet, a towel folded imperfectly, or a light left on in the hallway, all became reasons for dismissal. The staff began to whisper among themselves, calling him a man impossible to please. Word spread quickly, and soon, people hesitated to even accept a position in his home. No matter how grand the salary, working under him felt like a punishment. The millionaire, however, saw nothing wrong with his behavior. In his mind, discipline was necessary, and perfection was the only acceptable standard. His wealth had built an empire where no weakness was tolerated, and he carried that same expectation into every corner of his life. To him, staff were replaceable, like tools to be discarded when they no longer worked flawlessly. He never once considered the fear and insecurity he planted in the hearts of those who worked for him. Even the grandeur of his mansion felt sterile, lacking warmth. Though filled with priceless paintings, designer furniture, and imported rugs, there was no sense of home. The laughter of workers was silenced by their anxiety, and the air seemed heavy with tension. The house ran like a machine, efficient but soulless. Each firing made the millionaire more isolated. The halls of his mansion echoed with emptiness, and though new housekeepers were hired, they, too, quickly left or were sent away. The cycle never ended. Staff came and went, but none stayed long enough to build trust or comfort within the household. The millionaire never stopped to think about the human side of his decisions. To him, they were just employees, nothing more. Yet beneath his harsh exterior lay an unspoken truth. His actions weren't only about maintaining order, they were also an attempt to control the one thing he couldn't, life itself. Deep down, he carried a pain no amount of wealth could cure. His young daughter's illness weighed heavily on him, though he never expressed it openly. Firing housekeepers and demanding perfection became his way of lashing out at the world, of fighting against the helplessness he felt watching his child suffer. But to those around him, he was simply a man without compassion, a millionaire whose heart had grown cold. The staff who left his mansion never understood why he was so hard, and those who remained lived with the constant fear of being the next to go. In that home, under the shimmering chandeliers and behind the polished walls, perfection was demanded, but kindness was absent. The millionaire's reputation as a man impossible to work for only grew stronger with every dismissal, and still, he failed to realize that what his house truly needed was not flawless service, but warmth, humanity, and compassion, things his fortune could never buy. The new housekeeper arrived without much notice, carrying with her only a small bag and an air of quiet determination. She was not like the others who had come before her, nervous and eager to please from the very first moment. Instead, she carried herself with calmness, almost as if she knew the storm she was walking into but had already accepted it. Her clothes were simple, her hair tied back neatly, and her smile, though faint, radiated warmth. The mansion's staff looked at her with a mix of pity and curiosity. They had seen too many come and go, too many reduced to tears by the millionaire's unrelenting standards. They whispered among themselves, certain that this woman, too, would soon be dismissed. But something in her eyes suggested she might be different. When she was introduced to the millionaire, he barely acknowledged her. His usual stern glance swept over her as if she were another disposable worker, someone whose presence hardly mattered. Without any words of welcome, he simply handed her a long list of tasks, each more meticulous than the last. She took the list with steady hands, nodded politely, and went to work. There was no fear in her expression, no sign of the trembling nerves that others had displayed in his presence. She started her day with small things, carefully arranging the books in the library, dusting the corners of the grand staircase, and polishing the glass windows until they reflected the sunlight like mirrors. But unlike the others, she didn't rush. She worked with care, humming softly to herself, as though each task was less about impressing her employer and more about creating a sense of peace in the space. The other staff members noticed this difference. She wasn't panicked, wasn't glancing over her shoulder every second to see if she was being judged. Instead, she carried a gentle confidence, a sense that she understood her work had value beyond perfection. Over time, she began to notice things the millionaire overlooked. She saw the untouched meals left in the dining room, the toys in the corner of the child's bedroom, and the silence that seemed to weigh heavily on the house. While others focused only on meeting the impossible standards of cleanliness, she saw the emptiness in the millionaire's life, the sadness that lingered behind the walls of wealth. Most of all, she noticed the young girl, his daughter. The little girl was fragile, her small frame weakened by her illness. She rarely smiled and spent most of her time in her room, away from visitors and away from the laughter of other children. The housekeeper would pass by quietly, never intruding, but she saw the loneliness in the girl's eyes. She saw how the millionaire, though he tried to hide it, looked at his daughter with helplessness. It was clear that he loved her deeply, yet he seemed powerless, unable to provide the one thing she needed most, comfort. The housekeeper didn't push her way into their lives. Instead, she showed her kindness in small, subtle gestures. She would leave fresh flowers in the girl's room, choosing the brightest ones from the garden. She would tidy the toys gently, arranging them so the girl might feel encouraged to play again. Sometimes, while cleaning, she would hum softly outside the child's door, her soothing voice drifting into the quiet room like a lullaby. Unlike the other housekeepers who had seen the mansion as just another job, she treated it like a home that needed warmth. She didn't complain about the long hours, nor did she roll her eyes at the millionaire's strictness. Instead, she carried on with patience, never expecting praise or recognition. She seemed to understand that true service was not about perfection, but about presence. The millionaire, at first, hardly noticed these differences. He was too consumed with his worries, too accustomed to finding fault. But there were moments when he paused unexpectedly, realizing that the house felt lighter somehow. The flowers brightened his daughter's room, the air no longer carried the stifling tension of constant fear, and his child seemed calmer in the presence of the new housekeeper. Though he said nothing, a part of him began to sense that this woman was not like the others. What set her apart most was her ability to see beyond the surface. She wasn't just polishing floors and dusting shelves, she was quietly healing the atmosphere of the home. She was bringing something money could never buy, compassion. And though the millionaire remained blind to the depth of her kindness, her presence was already beginning to touch the most fragile part of his life, his daughter. The little girl's room was tucked away at the end of the long hallway, a place that seemed to exist in its own quiet world. While the rest of the mansion sparkled with polished marble floors and ornate chandeliers, her room carried a different weight. It was filled with soft blankets, books, and toys that no longer brought her joy. The curtains were often drawn, keeping out the bright sunlight, as though the very light itself was too harsh for her tired eyes. She had once been a lively child, full of laughter and energy, but illness had changed her life in ways too heavy for someone so young to bear. The treatments had taken her strength, leaving her body fragile and her spirit weary. The hardest part for her was the hair she had lost. She would touch her bare scalp gently, avoiding mirrors, because they only reminded her of what she no longer looked like. The vibrant girl she once knew was gone, replaced by a reflection that made her feel weak and incomplete. Her father, the millionaire, tried to shield her from the world's gaze. He bought her the best doctors, the most expensive medicines, and filled her room with toys and gifts he hoped would distract her from her pain. Yet all his wealth could not fix what truly hurt her, the loss of her confidence and the constant reminder that she was different from other children. When he looked at her, his heart broke in silence. He wanted to be strong for her, but in her eyes, he saw her sadness, and it pierced deeper than any business failure or personal loss ever could. The girl rarely left her room. She avoided visitors and never wanted to be seen. Even when her father encouraged her to play outside or join family dinners, she would shake her head, her voice barely above a whisper, "Not today, Papa." She felt safer behind closed doors, away from curious eyes or pitying looks. What she didn't say, but always felt, was the shame of looking different, of standing out when all she wanted was to be like every other child her age. The housekeeper, who had been quietly observing the family, noticed these things without being told. She could sense the heaviness that filled the girl's room, the loneliness that came from long hours spent in silence. She never intruded, but when she passed by, she would sometimes hear the faintest sound of the girl crying softly into her pillow. It touched her heart in a way that cleaning tasks never could. She realized that the child's pain was not just physical, it was emotional, a deep wound that no medicine alone could heal. She began to leave little tokens of kindness in the girl's room. A vase of bright flowers by the bedside, their fragrance filling the air with life. A small drawing tucked into one of her books, a cheerful sketch of a smiling sun. She made sure the room was always fresh, the blankets soft and warm, and the atmosphere welcoming. She hoped these gestures would remind the girl that she was cared for, that even in her quiet solitude, she was not forgotten. Still, the girl remained withdrawn. She avoided looking at herself, avoided laughing, avoided the simple joys that once made her childhood bright. Her illness had stolen not only her health but also her sense of self. She longed to feel normal again, to run outside with other children without feeling different. But every time she thought about her bald head, the thought of stepping outside filled her with shame and fear. Her father saw this but didn't know how to help. He would sit beside her, holding her hand, offering promises that one day she would get better. Yet, behind his strong words, he carried a helplessness he could not hide. For all his money and power, he could not give his daughter the one thing she needed most, the confidence to feel beautiful again. His wealth could buy cures and comfort, but it could not buy back her smile. And so, the mansion remained quiet, with the little girl hidden away in her room, her father consumed by silent sorrow, and the housekeeper watching from the shadows with growing compassion. She knew that within this fragile child lay a light waiting to shine again, but it would take more than riches or medicine to bring it back. It would take kindness, patience, and a gentle touch of humanity, something no fortune in the world could replace. The afternoon sunlight spilled gently through the window, casting a golden glow across the girl's room. She sat curled up on her bed, a book resting unopened in her lap. Though her father had filled the room with gifts and comforts, none of it mattered. She avoided the mirror on the wall and kept her gaze low, not wanting to face the image of herself she no longer recognized. Every strand of hair that had once framed her face was gone, replaced by the smooth skin of her scalp, a constant reminder of her illness. It was not just her appearance she mourned, it was her sense of belonging, her confidence, and the freedom of childhood that had been taken from her. The housekeeper entered quietly, her steps soft, carrying a small box in her hands. She had thought carefully about what she was about to do. For days, she had watched the girl retreat into herself, refusing to meet anyone's eyes, hiding from her own reflection. The housekeeper had seen suffering before, but there was something about this child's sorrow that pierced her heart. She had prepared this gift not out of duty, but out of love. "May I sit with you for a while?" she asked gently, her voice warm and kind. The girl looked up, hesitant at first, but then nodded faintly. The housekeeper sat beside her on the bed, the box resting on her lap. For a moment, she said nothing, allowing the silence to feel safe, not heavy. Then, with a tender smile, she opened the box and revealed what lay inside. A wig, soft and full, the color of warm chestnut brown. The girl's eyes widened. She reached out slowly, as though she wasn't sure if she was allowed to touch it. Her fingers brushed against the strands, and she gasped softly at how real it felt. Is this, for me? She whispered, her voice carrying both disbelief and hope. The housekeeper nodded. Yes, my dear. I thought you might like to try it. Only if you want to. Tears welled up in the girl's eyes as she looked at the wig. A storm of emotions passed over her face, fear, longing, excitement, and doubt. She hesitated, pulling her hand back. What if I look silly? She murmured, her voice trembling. You could never look silly, the housekeeper replied softly. You are already beautiful. This is just to help you see it again. With steady, gentle hands, the housekeeper lifted the wig from the box and placed it carefully over the girl's head. She adjusted it with care, smoothing the strands so they fell naturally around her face. Then she leaned back, her eyes glowing with pride. There, she said, her voice full of warmth. Why don't you take a look? The girl hesitated, her hands clutching the blanket nervously. Slowly, almost fearfully, she turned her gaze toward the mirror. For a moment, silence filled the room. Then her lips parted in surprise. She raised her hand, touching the strands that framed her face, and for the first time in weeks, her reflection felt familiar. Her cheeks flushed with color, her eyes shone with something she had lost, hope. A smile, small at first but growing wider, spread across her face. I look like me again, she whispered, tears sliding down her cheeks. The housekeeper felt her own eyes grow wet as she watched the transformation. It was not just the wig that had changed the girl's appearance, it was the way her spirit lifted, the way joy returned to her eyes. For weeks, the child had hidden from herself, but now she sat straighter, her smile filling the room with a light it hadn't seen in far too long. At that very moment, the millionaire walked past the doorway and paused. He had intended only to check on his daughter, but what he saw stopped him in his tracks. His little girl was smiling, truly smiling, for the first time in what felt like forever. His breath caught in his chest as he stepped into the room, his eyes fixed on her. Papa, the girl said softly, turning to him, her face glowing. Look at me. His heart ached as he looked at her, his eyes glistening. She looked radiant, her joy more beautiful than any treasure he had ever owned. And it wasn't the expensive medicines or toys that had brought her this happiness. It was a simple act of kindness, a gesture of thoughtfulness from someone he had overlooked. He turned his gaze to the housekeeper, his stern expression softening. For the first time, gratitude shone in his eyes. He realized in that moment that this woman had given his daughter something he, with all his wealth, could not provide, a piece of her confidence, her laughter, her childhood. And it was worth more than all the riches in his mansion. The girl hugged the housekeeper tightly, her laughter filling the room like music. For the first time in months, the mansion no longer felt cold or empty. It was alive again, warmed by the smile of a child and the compassion of a woman who had brought hope back into their lives. The room was filled with a kind of silence the millionaire had never experienced before. It was not the heavy, suffocating silence that usually haunted his mansion, but a stillness filled with awe. His daughter's laughter lingered in the air, light and melodic, something he thought he might never hear again. She twirled gently in front of the mirror, her small hands brushing over the wig as though she could hardly believe it was real. Her cheeks glowed with a rosy warmth, her eyes sparkled with excitement, and for a brief moment, she looked like the healthy, carefree child she once was. The millionaire stood frozen in the doorway, his chest tightening with emotion. He had poured millions into treatments, filled her room with every luxury money could buy, but not once had he been able to give her this, a reason to smile with pure joy. It was a humbling realization, one that struck him with more force than any business failure or financial setback ever had. His throat ached as he struggled to swallow his pride, his eyes wet with tears he had long denied himself. The housekeeper stood quietly beside the girl, her hands folded, watching with gentle satisfaction. She had not done this for recognition or praise, she had done it because her heart could not bear to see the child's spirit broken. Yet she felt the weight of the moment as the millionaire's gaze shifted toward her. For the first time, his eyes were not filled with cold judgment or irritation. They carried something far rarer, gratitude. He stepped into the room, his expensive shoes tapping softly against the polished floor. His daughter ran to him, her arms wrapping around his waist, her face lifted with joy. "Papa, do you see? Look at me," she exclaimed, her voice bubbling with excitement. He bent down, pulling her close, burying his face in her shoulder as tears slid freely down his cheeks. He did not care if the housekeeper saw his vulnerability. In that moment, he was not the powerful businessman, not the man feared for his strictness, he was only a father, overwhelmed by the gift of seeing his daughter happy again. When he finally looked up, his eyes met the housekeeper's. His voice, usually sharp and commanding, was soft, almost trembling. "Thank you," he whispered, the words foreign to his lips yet heavy with sincerity. "You've given her back something I thought I had lost forever." The housekeeper lowered her head respectfully. "She only needed to be reminded of who she is," she replied gently. "Sometimes, it isn't medicine or money that heals, it's love, kindness, and a little bit of hope." The millionaire's chest tightened again, not with anger or pride, but with shame. He thought of all the housekeepers he had dismissed so easily, the countless people he had treated as disposable. For years, he had demanded perfection, blind to the fact that what his home truly lacked was warmth. He had built walls of wealth and discipline around himself, yet those walls had only imprisoned him in loneliness. Now, in this simple act of compassion, he understood what he had been missing all along. He turned back to his daughter, who was still smiling, her joy radiating like sunlight. In her laughter, he felt something break inside him, his pride, his coldness, the hardened shell he had carried for so long. It was replaced by a deep, overwhelming love, not just for his child, but for the woman who had brought her light back. That evening, the mansion felt transformed. For the first time in years, it was not just a house of wealth and luxury, it was a home. The girls' laughter echoed through the halls, softening the edges of the marble, warming the cold gleam of the chandeliers. The staff, too, noticed the change. The tension that had always weighed on their shoulders seemed to lift, replaced by an unfamiliar but welcome sense of peace. The millionaire gathered his staff together and spoke words no one ever expected to hear from him. "I have been wrong," he admitted, his voice firm but humbled. "I demanded perfection and gave nothing in return. But today I learned that what truly matters cannot be bought. It is kindness, compassion, and the willingness to care for one another. From this day forward, this house will not be ruled by fear, but by respect." The staff exchanged astonished glances. Many had never seen this side of him. Some even fought back tears, knowing the weight of his words. And at the heart of it all was the housekeeper, who had shown him that change was possible, not through grand gestures, but through simple, genuine humanity. Later that night, the millionaire sat beside his daughter's bed as she drifted off to sleep, the wig still resting gently on her head. He held her hand, whispering a silent prayer of thanks, not for his wealth, not for his power, but for the lesson he had been given. He realized now that true riches were not measured in money, but in the love of his child, the warmth of a home, and the compassion of people willing to care. As he looked once more at the housekeeper before leaving the room, his eyes were no longer those of a distant employer, but of a man forever changed. He knew he could never repay her for what she had given, but he also knew he would never again take kindness for granted. For in the smallest act, a simple wig placed on a child's head, she had given him back his heart, and that was worth more than all the fortune he had ever built.